Well, again, let me begin by thanking you all for being here. You represent the bulk of the sportsmen in this country, and you all know this is a complicated issue. There's no singular solution to how we deal with the kinds of things that happened up in Newtown or in Colorado or just the general gun violence that exists in America today. And the President and I and the Cabinet, we understand that it's a complicated issue. And that's why when the President asked me to do this in conjunction with my colleagues in the Cabinet, what we did was we put together a pretty extensive list of what I would consider, we consider the stakeholders in wanting to deal with the issue of gun violence in America. And the first groups we met with will not surprise you because of my long association, but with all the national law enforcement organizations. But we also, just to give you a sense of what we've done so far and how you kind of fit into the matrix here, is we met with the medical community, the Academy of Family Physicians, the Academy of Neurology, Pediatrics, et cetera, a group of about 15 leading medical doctors representing organizations across the country who have an interest in us dealing with this issue. We've met with at-risk youth and children advocacy groups from the After School Alliance to Promise America to Boys and Girls Clubs, et cetera, because part of this is cultural as well as it is the actual weapons themselves. We've met with the domestic violence prevention community. We've met with the justice organizations like the ABA, the American Bar Association, and the National Legal Aid and Defenders Association, prosecutors. We've met with civil rights organizations. We've met with national service organizations, the Democracy Group, Kiwanis, Rotary International. We've met with youth groups. We've met with gun safety advocates. Yesterday, that meeting took place here. And the most, probably the best known is the Brady Campaign, but also a dozen other organizations that are concerned about gun safety. And then we met with educators and parents, from the school boards to the State School Officers Association, again, a dozen or so of those folks. And maybe one of the most important things that we've been focusing on is the mental health community. The American Academy for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, Mental Health of America, National Empowerment Center, National Council of Community Behavioral Health Centers, because there's an argument among health providers that there is this is a major component to deal with, particularly a lot of suicides as well that we're seeing today. And yesterday we finished up in this room with, I think it was 17 members of the faith community, which is all the years I've been doing this, the first time there has been an overwhelming consensus from the evangelical groups that are nationwide, but particularly those from rural areas, to the National Catholic Conference of Bishops, the National Council of Churches, the Muslim community, because this does have a significant moral dimension to it, how we make American communities safer, and how we go about it. And today we meet with you. Later I meet with some industry representatives as well as the NRA and the executive director of the Defense Small Arms Advisory Council, Importers, etc. So the point I'm trying to make to you is that we realize this is requires all the stakeholders to give us their best ideas as to how we deal with what, as I said at the outset, is a complicated problem. There's no single answer. If you go back and, like a lot of you, having been dealing with this issue since my days as a chairman of the Judiciary Committee and going all the way back to the 70s, if you look at every one of the tragic events that have attracted so much attention, it's hard to be able to pinpoint what you could have done to assure it wouldn't have happened. But there's also things we know. We know that there are certain actions we take that have diminished have diminished the extent of the gun violence that otherwise would be occurring in the United States. And so the kinds of things that there's an emerging set of recommendations, not coming from me, but coming from the groups we've met with. And I'm going to focus on the ones that relate primarily to gun ownership and the type of weapons can be owned. And one is there's a surprising, so far, a surprising recurrence of suggestions that we have universal background checks. Not just close the gun show loophole, but total universal background checks, including private sales. There has been a lot of discussion from the groups we've met with so far, and I think the Attorney General has been almost in all the meetings with me, will tell you, is how we strengthen those background checks. What additional information should be available, if any, and how do we get the information, for example, convicted felons in the state, how do they get on the NICS? How do they get in the NICS? That is the thing that the gun dealer goes to check whether you're background, whether you're a felon. Doesn't do a whole lot of good if in some states they have a backlog of 40, 50, 60,000 felons that they never register here. So we got to talk about, there's a lot of talk about how we entice, or what is the impediment keeping states from relaying this information. There's also a good deal of talk about gun safety and what responsibility goes along with gun ownership, which is something I'm really anxious to talk to all of you about. There's also been it's surprising. My colleagues, my former colleagues in the Senate who have been pretty universally opposed to any restrictions on gun ownership or what type of weapons can be purchased, et cetera. There is, I've never quite heard as much talk about the need to do something about high capacity magazines as I've heard spontaneously from every group that we've met with so far. And the last area, which is an area that is that's come up, is the whole question of the ability of any federal agency to do any research on the issue of gun violence. For example, we're meeting before the week is out with the gaming industry. I don't mean gambling, the video gaming industry. To use Pat Moynihan's expression when we first started talking about the so-called Biden crime bill back in the 80s, he used the example of, he said, we've been defining deviancy down. He used the example of the assassination of the mob boss in 1936 in a barber chair in Chicago, making the front page of every paper in America, and then he stood on the Senate floor and he held up, I think it was the New York Times on page 54, I'm making it up, and it was in the very back of the paper, where an entire family, including grandmother, mother, father, children, were basically assassinated in their apartment, thinking it may have been about a drug deal, and it made page 54. And he said, we've defined deviancy down. Well, one of the things that we've been prohibited from doing, beginning in the early part of this century, in about 2004, is just even the Center for Disease Control gathering up information about the kinds of injuries and what are the injuries and what are the source of the injury. I mean, it kind of reminded me in the meeting yesterday. I was around in the 70s, and the only guy that may remember this, I hope I don't insult him, is Ray LaHood, but because he knows all about the automobile industry as well as our whole question of traffic safety and highway safety. There was a big fight when I first got to the Senate that had begun in the late 60s through early 70s, where the automobile industry was very reluctant to allow the Department of Transportation to acquire statistics on the type of accidents that occurred. They were were not able to literally acquire the information, because the concern was it would lead to calls for some rational regulations related to everything from guardrails to automobiles. And I remember, Ray, you may remember, that when we finally broke through and the Department of Transportation NHTSA started keeping this information, they find out, if my memory is correct, that the vast majority of drivers operating the automobile who were killed in an automobile accident were because the steering wheel actually broke their solar plexus, damaged their heart, or penetrated their upper body cavity. The reason why the industry didn't want everybody knowing that, or as my supposition was, it became logical. Do something about steering wheels. Have them so they can collapse. Make sure that front end collisions, there's a ability to absorb shock. And what did it lead to? It led to, all of a sudden, we said to automobile manufacturers, you cannot make an automobile that doesn't have a steering wheel the steering column with the following attributes. You have to make an automobile that can absorb X amount of shock. All of a sudden, when we found out passengers are being killed because they're being thrown through windshields, or, if memory serves me, skull fractures, hitting their head on the crossbar, all of a sudden we started talking about, it made sense, well, why don't we have airbags? Well, they didn't want to have airbags. Well, guess what? You have airbags now. We're saving lives. So there was a real effort to deny the government just gathering the information. Well, as you know, there are real restrictions now on the ability of any agency in the government to gather information about what kind of weapons are used most to kill people, how many weapons are used that are trafficked weapons, are weapons used in gang warfare in our major cities, and drug, are they legally purchased? Are they purchased through straw man? Is there a trafficking operation? I mean, we don't have that information. And the irony is we're prohibited under laws and appropriations bills from acquiring it. So I want to talk to you all a little bit about, as an owner of shotguns, as a guy, I'm no great hunter, it's mostly skeet shooting for me. I don't quite understand why everybody be afraid of whether or not we determine what is happening out there. So there's a whole lot of things that I want to talk to you about, but I did feel obliged to tell you what we've done so far and what we're doing from here. We are going to be meeting again. This afternoon we have meetings. Tomorrow I have meetings. I'm trying to set up telephone conferences with the manufacturers because there's got to be some common ground here to not solve every problem, but diminish the probability that what we've seen in these mass shootings will occur, and diminish the probability that our children are at risk in their schools, and diminish the probability that weapons will be used in firearms will be used in dealing with the aberrant behavior that takes place in our society. So that's what this is all about. There is no conclusion that I've reached, and with my colleagues, I'm putting together a series of recommendations for the president that he will take a look at. There's a real, very tight window to do this. I committed to him I'd have these recommendations to him by Tuesday. It doesn't mean it's the end of the discussion, but the public wants us to act. I'll conclude by saying, in all my years involved in these issues, there is nothing that has pricked the consciousness of the American people. There is nothing that has gone to the heart of the matter more than the visual image people have of little 6-year-old kids riddled, not shot with a straight bullet, riddled with bullet holes in their classroom. And the public demands we speak to it. I'm not sure that we can guarantee this will never happen again, as the President said, even if what we do only saves one life, it makes sense. And I think we can do a great deal without in any way imposing on or impinging on the rights of the Second Amendment that the Second Amendment guarantees. That's what this is about. I thank you all for being here, and now with your permission and the permission of the press, we'll get down to some business here, and I thank the press for
Thanks, Press. We're going to wrap this up. Thank you, Press. We're going to wrap this up, guys.
Well, we're going to talk about all the things I've talked about here.